All right, hello. Thank you for coming to our talk. Last talk of the day, glad you guys are still here. So in this talk, we're going to be sharing some of the insights that we've built up from teaching what is considered one of the most technically challenging topics in security. This is experience that we've gathered over several years, and I think you guys are going to enjoy some of the stuff that we have in store for you. So the talk's titled Building Cyber Armies at Scale. And so a brief intro. My name is Markus Gaasedelen, and this is my coworker Patrick Biernat. We're co-founders of a small security research firm called Rep2 Systems, but also alumni of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, just up the river, for those of you that are familiar or local. So just a brief shout out to RPI. RPI has been pumping out some extremely talented security-oriented students the past couple of years. And this presentation helps shed some light on the storm that's kind of brewing up there. So this is a brief agenda of the talk. We'll start off by defining binary exploitation since it's the whole basis of the talk, and for those that are not familiar with what we're going to be trying to teach, essentially, or what we've taught. And so after that, we're going to cover some traditional methods for learning binary exploitation, along with some of the more recent innovations that we've kind of added to this space. We'll also have an interactive demo for those of you that actually want to pull out your laptop if you're interested to play around with it. And that's going to be in the third session of the talk here. So, moving on, binary exploitation. So yeah, since this is the basis of the talk, we'd like to provide some background to ensure everyone is on the same page and you have some idea what this term encompasses. So what's a binary? You're gonna hear us use this term throughout the whole talk. And in the context of this talk, it's an executable file such as an exe, an elf, a mako, or any other kind of code container that runs on a machine. And a machine could be your phone, it could be your laptop, it could be whatever computing device that has a CPU in it. For you on Windows, binaries look kind of something like this. This is just a file listing of your System32 directory where most of your operating system kind of resides. EXEs, DLL files, those are libraries, stuff like that. Linux users, I'm sure you're familiar where binaries are. They're all over the place in your bin directory, whatnot. And so as a better, higher level kind of general example, your web browser is what you might call an application. And every application is often made up of many binaries working together on your system to do whatever. And so say one binary in your browser could be responsible for executing JavaScript code, another could be responsible for rendering the HTML, that is the web page, or communicating with websites over the network, stuff like that. And you can take your phone as another example. All those little apps on your home screen, anything you download from the iTunes store, those are all apps backed by multiple binaries, potentially. Yeah, so Angry Birds, Fortnite, iMessage, Signal, all of these are binaries. They're all applications, essentially. Even your operating system on your computer or your phone, iOS. Let's just, in a general sense, let's just say they're all made up of lots of binaries that work together and contain code. So an exploit, since we know what a binary is, we can kind of define an exploit. And so when we say exploit in this talk, we're going to be talking about specially crafted data that employs vulnerabilities, aka CVEs, to force a binary or some code into doing something that was never intended by the original programmer, right? And so something unintended is a very broad, ambiguous term, and that's because, I guess, yeah, there's a million different things that could go wrong with your program or it could behave in ways that you don't expect. And in terms of binary exploitation, in the most general sense, an exploit is used to gain access to computer systems through these enigmatic doors that are not meant to exist. So they're kind of like skeleton keys for technology. They get you into systems in ways that most people would think impossible, essentially. And almost exclusively, truly novel exploits, which are generally called 0 days, are used around the world by nation states or intelligence communities in the game of spies, right? So the right chain of exploits can be used to break into virtually any device or system to steal sensitive information, install persistent malware, stuff like that. And so a few of you, a great example of exploits in action kind of happened in 2016, summer 2016, almost 2 years to the date, August, where an iOS exploit was discovered in the wild by a group of security researchers. And this was the first time that an iOS exploit was actually found in the wild, which is kind of a big deal. And so a state-sponsored actor was using this exploit to target a human rights activist called Ahmed Mansour in the UAE. And this is kind of what it looked like when it got delivered to his phone. And so by clicking a link that was texted to him, so you can kind of see some links on here, in 2 separate messages, so they tried twice to get him to click this, basically. And he didn't click it either time. But if you would have clicked this, the exploit would have broken it into his phone, giving the attackers the ability to steal all his text messages, his emails, contacts, pictures, Facebook, Signal, you name it. And not only that, but they can now track him 24/7. They could turn on his mic, they could turn on his video, etc. And the reason he knew not to click these links is he had actually been targeted by this, a similar attack in the past. And so he knew to forward it this time onto some very experienced researchers who were able to actually capture this and document it. And so just think about this though. Someone breaking into your phone. Phones are our most personal computing device, especially in the modern age. So if you feel uncomfortable with your significant other ever digging around in your phone, let's say, you can bet you don't want an intelligence agency in there either. And so we don't even know the extent of our own secrets that we have in our devices, right? You're kind of maybe worried if someone's shuffling through your phone, you don't know what's in there. And so from the perspective of intelligence, it should be no surprise that there's a lot of money in building these types of capabilities. So this is kind of a, almost like a sell to us at this price by a independent exploit broker. And so you can see in iOS Safari RCE, which means remote code execution against the browser, they're paying upwards of $2 million, $2 to $3 million to get that kind of capability. And the thing is, they're an exploit broker, so they're actually going to turn around and start selling this to other people for millions more dollars. I mean, iOS exploits can range up to potentially $10 million on the black market. Because imagine that, being able to break into someone's phone, like with them unsuspecting from anyone in the world, that's a huge amount of intelligence you can gather, a lot of damage you can do to individuals or broader circles. So another famous incident you may have heard about some years back was Stuxnet. And so Stuxnet was a state-sponsored piece of malware which was used to destroy centrifuges in Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And so this was a joint US-Israeli program, allegedly, to try to essentially use cyber warfare to do kinetic damage. And so to get deep enough into the facility, Stuxnet employed at least 4 different zero-day exploits to gain unauthorized access to Windows computers with the goal of causing, destructive damage to these giant gas cylinders, essentially, deep within a nuclear facility in Iran. All from, behind a keyboard somewhere in the US. So another big one, many of you have probably heard about Eternal Blue, which happened about a year ago. So that was an epic exploit that leaked from the NSA in 2017. It's estimated to cause close to $20 billion in damage so far, and was also, honestly, the closest we've come to seeing a nuclear bomb detonate on the internet. So all this shows that exploits are analogous to cyber weapons, where cyber is the 5th domain of war. So teaching individuals how to make these unique capabilities has started to become more of a matter in crisis with national security. They're actually calling these exploits cyber weapons. These are starting to be used in war, effectively. And so in 2017, Alex Stamos, the former CSO of Facebook, who's now going to be a professor at Stanford, he used this slide specifically, this is from his talk, to visualize the categories of traditional InfoSec. At the apex of this field sits a tiny pool of individuals at the very top. They don't even have their own section. It's literally a vertex at the very top. And this small pool of individuals are the ones that are actually qualified to develop the caliber of exploits that we teased in the previous slides there. It's a very, very tiny portion of the field. And so this is in part due to the immense amount of prerequisite knowledge that's required to produce an exploit, but also the rising complexity of writing these really unique technologies. But one thing to keep in mind is that the skills and craftsmanship required to make these capabilities, they're relevant far beyond the tradecraft of exploitation. You really have to know the system in and out, and you have to know these binaries that you're trying to exploit better than the authors, better than anyone in the world, basically. So I'm going to hand it over to Patrick and let him talk about some of the existing exploit education. And yeah.
All right, so now that we've reviewed most of that subject and we're all kind of on the same page, we can move on to discussing how binary exploitation has traditionally been learned by its practitioners. And so, as a general rule, this is a very informal field. There's no real standard path available towards learning binary exploitation. You can't get a degree in this stuff. There's no certifications that really cover this, at least not in any depth necessary to actually target modern applications. And so as a result of that, most vulnerability researchers are either self-taught or they've been mentored by their coworkers over the years and throughout their career. And so this is a really complex topic. This diagram, it shows kind of like a rough hierarchy of all the concepts and skills you need to have before you can start independently performing modern vulnerability research. And so the first, fourth to third of this diagram kind of shows the basic low-level concepts you need to know. So you need to know everything from assembly up through the operating system, how memory is laid out, those kinds of things. And once you finally have an understanding of all those, you finally start to get into the kind of basics of exploitation, which is sort of like stack smashing, shell coding. And then once you learn those, you can move on to modern mitigation techniques and modern exploitation techniques. So how do people start learning this kind of stuff? Well, one of the most common ways is through war games. And war games are a series of computer security challenges that are meant to hone and refine one's technical skills. So here's some examples of some really popular war games. You got Pwnable KR, Smash the Stack, Over the Wire. And these have kind of emerged in the past couple of years as sort of the standard. If somebody would ask me or ask somebody else who's kind of deep into this field, where do I get started, I would point them to one of these websites and say, do the challenges. So they look kind of like this. They're structured usually based around levels. So you would start at level 0, you would solve that, you get on to level 1, solve that, go to level 2, and so on. Basically the progression is like we have below. You would find a challenge that's difficult for your level of expertise, you would solve it, and you repeat that over and over again until you become an expert hacker. And so moving on to CTFs, these are similar to war games, but these are typically in a time box and team context. So many of you guys are probably somewhat familiar with CTFs. There's one going on upstairs right now. And these have been getting a lot more popular the past few years. They've been getting a lot more attention because they are a really valuable teaching tool. So what we're looking at here on the slide is actually just a kind of a global informal leaderboard called CTF Time, where all the different teams from across the world kind of gather and see how they stack up to one another. So if you haven't heard of CTFs, they typically look something like this. You'll have a wide selection of challenges from across multiple domains in security, and try to solve them in order to get points for your team. So we're interested in binary exploitation, and so most of the stuff we tend to focus on is either in reverse engineering, which is tearing apart binaries and understanding how they work without source code, and exploitation, which is actually writing exploits and taking control of binaries. This is kind of what it would look like if you were to actually write an exploit. So this is a picture from a CTF we did a few years ago, where we were given a binary, we found some vulnerabilities, we exploited it, and we were able to run our own code on a remote server that was running this binary. Using that, we could dump a bunch of memory from it, and then we could find this, we find this flag that's right here. Actually, I think it's circled, yeah. So in the context of a CTF, you're trying to steal these flags. You submit these, you get points for your team, and that's how you've proven that you've found and exploited vulnerabilities in binaries. The analogy to the real world is this would be something like a password, a username, maybe coordinates, phone numbers, basically sensitive data that you've forced a program to give up. And so CTFs and war games are a great resource. They're a ton of fun, and they force you to learn a whole bunch of new things. Typically, when you start a CTF challenge, you don't really know what's going to be expected of you to solve it. And as a result of that, you will be reading dozens and dozens of articles and blog posts, probably talking to multiple people. all in search of that one tiny bit of information that will finally give you a breakthrough and kind of show you the way towards solving the problem. The other side of that, of course, as you can see in the slide, is that the vast majority of the information you find is not actually relevant. And so you might spend 6, 8, 12 hours working on a challenge that, if you knew the prerequisite knowledge, would take you maybe only 2 hours. And so taking a look at how that process goes, we can start to sort of comment on the difficulty curve associated with binary exploitation. It looks kind of like this, or that's usually how we like to draw it. At the very bottom, we have things like C and C++. You need to learn what pointers are and how they work. You need to learn what binaries are and how they work. You need to learn assembly language for whatever architecture you're targeting. You need to learn your tools, so GDB, your debugger, IDA, your disassembler. You need to learn memory layout. And these are all, or these at least tend to be extremely non-intuitive topics for most people. And that's true not only for the general public, but also for people who already have potentially significant computer science experience. And as a result of that, that's why this curve here at the very beginning is extremely steep. It's almost vertical. You're basically trying to learn tons of really non-intuitive things very quickly, just so you can start to contribute. So we get there. Let's say you're dedicated to this. You've taken the time to learn these topics, and you start actually getting into more traditional kind of exploitation concepts. So you got like stack smashing, shell coding. Maybe you're starting to learn what ROP and dep are. And so these are still very unfamiliar. They're still kind of weird. But we can start to see this curve like not really being as vertical anymore. These topics and the knowledge required to get around them kind of builds naturally upon the framework that you've gotten from the first maybe 5 or 6 points. Once you've mastered those, you get into other stuff: ASLR, deep exploitation, use after free vulnerabilities, race conditions, kernel, other stuff. This is the kind of thing that starts being relevant to modern contexts and modern targets. They're still very difficult, but at this point, you've learned enough and you know enough that you can kind of incrementally learn on your own. And so that curve is definitely reality, but it also represented a big problem for us when we were leading RPISec. And the reason for that is once people start getting really good at this stuff, it's time to graduate and they can no longer compete with the club. And so our first attempt at kind of trying to tame that learning curve was a class called Modern Binary Exploitation that we taught in the spring of 2015. And so what we really wanted to do was to give a fairly large group of students the ability to tear through binaries, understand them, discover vulnerabilities, and then ultimately exploit those vulnerabilities so that they would be able to compete effectively with us during CTFs. And you can think of this as trying to guide a large group of students through this maze of the exploitation skill tree all in a single semester. So they would probably come in with some of this knowledge, like C and C++, just by going through courses at RPI. But then we'd have to teach them other low-level concepts like binaries, operating systems, pointers, assembly, memory layout, all the different tools, and then finally the basics of modern exploitation. And so we had hoped to take all of these topics, condense them down into a single semester, but still keep the class fairly complete. And so this is just a kind of random picture that we took during that first iteration. And there's a few interesting things about the class that aren't immediately obvious. So first off, this was a very large group of people for such a niche subject. We had, I want to say, about 50 people taking this class. And we had extremely varied demographics. So this was a 4,000 level course, which at RPI corresponds roughly to a senior level course. And we had people from basically the entire spectrum. So we had freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors taking it. We actually had 2 or 3 graduate students that sat in and also completed the course. And we had, I want to say, maybe 3 to 4 ROTC members, which is the Reserve Officer Training Corps. But this is all basically building up to the point that this was a large group of people that we were trying to teach these very niche subjects to. And so we thought the class ultimately was very successful. We received really good feedback from students, And many of those students who took this class ended up being core members and then also future leaders of RPISec. We also open sourced this, and it became an extremely popular resource for the entire security community. So you might not be able to read that, but we got about like 2,600 stars on GitHub, which is pretty high, much higher than we expected for a topic that's this niche within security. And so the course was structured mostly as a traditional class might be, with the exception that we actually built our own war game, which would basically sub in for labs and homeworks. So we'd give 2 lectures a week, and then students would have to log on to our war game and solve a series of challenges in order to get credit for that particular week. And so we did consider the class a huge success, but we knew there were also a ton of ways that we could have improved it further. So the next couple slides, I'm going to go through about half the syllabus and just point out some of the pain points that we encountered while teaching it. And so here we have the first real lab right after the syllabus and review. We're trying to teach people reverse engineering, and to do that we need them to install a whole bunch of tools. We need them to install at least one virtual machine, depending on what their host operating system is. And so right after that, that was a giant pain. We were getting a whole bunch of questions about VMware versus VirtualBox, getting questions about Mac, Linux, and Windows specific topics, all sorts of hardware quirks. If you already work with VMs, halfway through, your keyboard stops working. And overall, I'd say probably maybe lost half the class just getting everybody set up and on the same page. Moving on to the third lab, we have this sort of similar setup where you get students kind of overwhelmed by all the new tools and all the new workflows. So we need 2 VMs generally in order to run the tools that we needed for the course. So IDA, which is a disassembler, lets you analyze binaries without source code. That runs on Windows. GDB as a debugger, and that runs on Linux. So people were having to constantly flip back and forth between these VMs. At the same time, these are 2 very disjoint, very complex tools. They both perform different actions, and it's not really immediately obvious unless you have prerequisite knowledge to kind of map what one tool is showing you onto the output of the other tool. And so you kind of end up in a situation like this. People are trying to connect to this war game that we made. They're trying to set up their VMs. At the same time, they're trying to learn what SSH is. How do I actually connect to the server? Maybe I'm on Windows, maybe I'm on Linux. It's a different process for both. They're trying to learn Vim and how to actually type their exploit scripts. They don't know how to quit. Emacs, it's even worse. They get their VM, they install their tools, and it looks like this. It's miserable. They open IDA and it's oh my god, this is the most complicated piece of software I've ever seen in my life. Maybe I don't want to take this class anymore. And I get this. It's your disk's gone. Reinstall the VM. So that's not great, right? The 2 first classes, we just by the very nature of teaching this stuff, we're spending a whole lot of time dealing with problems that we don't want to deal with. But we got through that, so we're going on to the next couple of lectures. Lecture 4, we just got finished teaching people how binaries work, how assembly works, how Linux works, and now we're basically breaking that entire paradigm and starting to teach them how to break assumptions and how to take over binaries. But all those concepts are very foreign, right? And you don't really get any feedback from these tools. Debuggers weren't made to help people write exploits, they're made to help people who have source code fix their programs. So even if students understood the topics and were going through the process correctly, they couldn't really tell a lot of the time. They couldn't tell they're doing the right thing because it's a very opaque field. And the end result of that is they feel lost, even if they are on the right track. Next, we're doing shell coding, so we're trying to inject our own code into processes after we've exploited them. And suddenly they have to not only read assembly, but they also need to write their own assembly that does whatever nefarious, malicious action we're trying to get them to do. And so you're trying to learn to write this foreign language on top of everything else that we've been trying to teach. And finally, we had Lab 6. And so format string vulnerabilities, maybe some of you are familiar with them. These were kind of popular or somewhat they would come up in CTFs here and there, so we wanted to touch on them, but in real life they are no longer relevant. Almost always no longer relevant. If you try to compile something with a modern compiler that has one of these vulnerabilities, it will just throw an error and tell you to fix your code. And so this all kind of leads into the question of what makes a course really high value for a student. In my opinion, at least, it's courses that teach you information you can't really just Google in 5 minutes. And even if you can Google the information, maybe it's very tricky to find your way through it, which is where instructors come in. And finally, a high-value course needs to ultimately teach you things that are important to you and let you solve problems that you actually care about solving. And so all the time that we spend on all these little things, and there's a bunch more throughout the rest of the course, is ultimately stuff that we consider resulting in time wasted. And so keeping all of that in mind, we wanted to create a new experience that incorporates the most effective parts of CTFs and war games, but also dramatically dampens that learning curve. So this past year, this spring, we had the opportunity to teach a revised version of modern binary exploitation. Except this time, we had one major difference in the fact that we put everything that you needed to learn this stuff into a single browser tab. And so right off the bat, right, this lets us eliminate all those set of problems, that whole first slide of people's VMs not working, stuff not integrating well. That all goes out the window because everything's encapsulated right into Google Chrome, for example. On top of that, it runs on literally anything, so you can get a Chromebook for $100 and start learning how to pwn binaries. You don't have to worry about your laptop not being able to run 3 VMs at once. And so here we have a close-up of the platform that's encapsulated into a single Chrome tab. So to actually get to it, all you need to do is punch in the URL, hit enter, and once you do that, you're ready to start exploiting binaries within a few seconds. So on the right, what we did is we put a new implementation of GDB that also has some Linux features that sort of pop into existence when they are relevant. And on the left, we put in a fully featured disassembler that's similar to IDA Pro or Binary Ninja, if you use either one of those. We click onto the source tab, and we end up in a code explorer. It's kind of more or less like Sublime Text that would show you all the relevant source code for the particular level or lab you were working through. Then we quickly click into the Python tab. We get a fully featured Python terminal that integrates directly with everything else on the platform. And below that, we have a code editor that integrates directly with the Python terminal right above it. And so from that editor, you can write Python scripts that will interact with and ultimately exploit whatever level you're currently running. And so we talked a bit about this. I'm going to hand the mic over to Marcus, and he'll give us a tour. I guess it'll be this one.
Okay, so we're going to see how this goes. Patrick's going to have to try and drive the demo from the other screen. All right.
Control shift.
Wait, right.
Or do you have it up already?
Yeah, I might have it up already. Over there. Okay, flip that one. Hold Windows and move it over. Alright, yeah, just move it over to the other screen. Alright. So yeah, if you want to punch in that URL, if you actually have your laptop out, we can throw it back up there maybe. Or I don't know. Alright, well, anyone need the URL if anyone's actually interested? Alright. So I'm gonna try and narrate some of what Patrick's going through here. And so here we just punch it into Chrome, right? We're instantly loaded. Maybe you can hit F11 too if you want. Is that gonna work?
We'll see what it does.
All right. If you hit F11, now you got it full screen. Great. That's just Chrome features here. So on the left here, we've got the source code view of. This is one of the lecture examples we used relatively early in the course. This was when we were trying to teach students about memory layout and a little bit about how the stack works for those that are familiar. All the binaries in our course were written in C code, and it would compile into modern Ubuntu ELF files running on essentially a real system, kind of on the back end, but in a emulated context. And so you can see this is just a pretty simple C program. Yeah, this is the source. If you click the disassembly tab up here, you can see this is the compiled version of the code. So this is all the disassembly for it. You can scroll through it. This is what your binary looks like to the computer. This is what your program looks like to the computer. And so this is Intel x86, specifically 64-bit. And so it's integral to be able to navigate and understand this code for binary exploitation. You need to know the system inside and out. And so students, it's very difficult to read. You've learned your way around it. At this point, I kind of can recognize very quickly what's important and what isn't, but our students get very overwhelmed by this. And so you can put comments in. You can very easily put comments into the code. You want to move your cursor off? So you can see that green thing, he just dropped a comment in there. And so students, it's important for students to be able to annotate their code. And this is the same thing you can do in real-world reverse engineering and disassemblers to better understand how the program works when you're trying to break it. And so there's also a graph view, which is super common in the leading disassemblers. And the graph view lets you kind of see the control flow. Oh no. Oh, so the control flow of the function and the binary and the program structure, so you can see how it looks. And this helps you understand conditionals and loops and stuff like that. And so that was a very important part. We want to integrate that in here too. All right, so let's go back to the source tab. And let's start running. So during lecture, we would generally be teaching the students various concepts about how this stuff works. We would complement this platform with some slides that we're hoping to remove entirely, essentially. But if you run the binary, so you can, over the debugger on the far right, he's typing in the run command, and the binary is running. And so it printed out some stuff up here, and it's asking for some data. You can see this in the code over here. And so it's asking him to enter some data. And so go ahead and enter some data. So he's just going to punch in some A's, send it through. And then it prints out, since this was an educational lecture example, we're trying to show people how your data goes into programs and how the computer stores it and what stuff looks like. We actually print out a visualization of the stack over here. And you can actually see his data that went into the program. So capital A's, the hex code for them is 41, so 414141. That's all his A's that he sent in. This is it being stored in the program. You can also see essentially these other variables. So the program stores the data he sent into a 32-byte buffer, but there's two other variables around it, which is below, two numbers essentially, which are below and above. And you can see them also here in memory with some like padding bytes that the compiler inserted for whatever purposes. But now I want Patrick to run it again. And there's a vulnerability with this application where it doesn't properly check how much data it's reading in from the user. And so if Patrick sends in a lot of data, that's good.
The buffer overrun.
Yeah, right. But we got buffer overflow. You want to expand it out.
Do a little injection there.
Right. Yeah, you're getting the fire, right? And so students, this is where we first start to introduce students to memory corruption. Doing something unintended, and we want to start doing something controlled, right? And so we're going to, in this example, we start to teach students that we're not only corrupting memory now, so the green is what memory the programmer intended for us to use. But now we've corrupted some padding, which really didn't matter, but past that, it gets really bad. We start corrupting things that we never should have touched in the program state. And so Patrick has entered too much data, it's done some crazy stuff to the internal program state, and it actually crashed. It failed because it's like, I can't continue, you have to figure this out, and the program just crashes. And so that is something unintended, right? That can mean downtime, that can mean whatever. And so now, we're going to do a more targeted corruption of memory, such that we can change the behavior of the program. And so, so Patrick is going to he's going to write an exploit, a very simple, it's like the hello world of exploits for binary exploitation. And so over here, he's writing in the Python terminal that we talked about. You can bring up the Python terminal on either side. And what he's doing is he's writing a little Python script that will interact with the program. Because as the course gets more advanced, we had students writing exploit scripts that were hundreds of lines that have to interact with the binary in very advanced ways, that have to send data and read data in a very specific manner. And so Patrick's writing a little exploit. You can see he essentially connects to the process so that he can essentially send data in or receive data, just kind of like reading over std in or std out. He's got a syntax error somewhere. Yeah, read Untitled. And so his little program here, his Hello World of exploitation, is going to essentially, he has scripted it to have a payload. He's going to send 32 A's. Actually, you want to press control plus sign. Yeah, we're going to blow this up a little bit so you guys can read better. Maybe a little too much. So we got 32 A's. He's sending that in. It filled up his buffer as expected, as the program expected. But now we actually want him to corrupt the data past the end of the buffer. And so something I guess I haven't mentioned down here, which is a really important part, is down at the bottom, we have these little things that we call checkpoints. So the very first checkpoint of this level, these are like little goalposts to help guide the students from them not knowing what they're supposed to do to have some kind of destination in mind. And so the first checkpoint was essentially to corrupt memory and crash the program. And he did that, and it popped when it happened. But the second checkpoint is asking him to essentially corrupt memory in a very specific way such that he can go down a code path that should never happen in normal execution. And so he's writing a little bit of boilerplate code right here, which is something that we just teach the students. It's okay if you are kind of lost with our example. The students had a lot more context when we gave this lecture. But this is just supposed to kind of demonstrate the flow of lectures or the interactions of the platform. And so he's typing something here. You want to bring up the source over here? Yeah. So there's this code path that exists down here that checks if this below, which is basically just an integer, a number. It checks if this, oh no, you scrolled sideways, there you go. It checks if this variable below equals OX deadbeef bad code, which is just some big number, essentially. But that variable is only ever set right up here to 5151515151. It's never touched by the program code normally. So any average C programmer would look at this and be like, oh, you can never go in that condition, which is a winning condition, basically, that we created to help teach the concepts of this. And so we're going to corrupt memory, and we're going to set that variable to something it never should have been, specifically deadbeef bad code. So Patrick's going to punch that in over here as part of his exploit, part of his specially crafted data that he's sending into the program. Okay, and we're going to run this. Ooh, and so it popped a checkpoint, saying congrats, you're on the right track. Up here it actually says correct, debug flag captured. And so that's the print path. He went through the winning condition code. And now, but the thing is, in the real world, he's using a debugger still. He's kind of like, he was in a state that he could debug his exploit if he needed to. And this is very similar to the lab environment. Let's say you're 10 floors underground in Fort Meade and you're trying to write an exploit for an iOS device or something. You have your debugger, you can test everything. But in the real world, when you're out there trying to throw the device or throw the exploit at your target, or you're in the nuclear enrichment facility, you can't be there debugging Iran's computers and figuring out why your exploit's not working. It has to work the first time. And so what we ask students to do then is run their exploit in a mode where they're not allowed to do any instrumentation, any debugging, and if their exploit lands, they get the flag. And so Patrick is going to run the exploit against essentially a live binary with no debugging, no nothing. And he captured the flag. And so you can actually see the flag up there. We give the students flags, they're like little pieces of reward, right? It's like giving, like, a piece of candy. And so that's it, he completed the lab. And then that could have been, for example, one of the homework assignments for the student. And so there's multiple assignments, multiple lecture examples that we go through. And so that's basically the demo. And this is actually something that, it's a project that we developed for the class, and we haven't actually talked about publicly yet. So congrats for those of you that are here. We started reaching out privately to some academia and military-industrial complex partners to start maybe collaborating on places this could go. And so we're going to go back to the slides, hopefully. Maybe we can do this. Wait, let's F11 first. Yeah, just congrats. All right, hit the present. All right. out your, yeah, you're still going.
Right, so a primary design goal that we had when making that whole platform was to make the tools as true to life as possible. And by that I mean, whenever it's feasible, they should behave exactly like industry standard tooling would behave. So even though students mostly take our class to learn the concepts behind binary exploitation, being comfortable in the actual workflow is also extremely valuable. That means you can take what you learn in our class and apply it against real targets in a matter of minutes or hours, instead of days, weeks, or even months potentially. And so you probably noticed these little green check marks that were popping up. Marcus actually called them out. And so we called these checkpoints throughout the course, and they're really an integral part of our teaching process that just wasn't possible in the past iterations of MBE, and that's just due to technical limitations. If you're running binaries on a Linux server for 50 people, we just don't have the level of introspection or insight needed to make something like this happen. And so as instructors, we basically just write these 10, 20 lines of JavaScript, and we can integrate that with the platform to create these check marks for whatever levels or labs we're developing. They help keep students on the rails, like we were talking about way earlier in the presentation with students feeling lost. We can detect when they start corrupting memory, when they get to a certain program state, and we can kind of give them hints that, yep, you're going along the right path, like keep exploring, just so it's not such an endless void of, I don't know what I'm doing. And another thing that we tried very hard to do was take cues from game design when we were building the new course. And so, for example, checkpoints, they're not only there to keep students on this one path through the course, but they're also kind of act as achievements or milestones, especially in the later levels that get much more complex. And this kind of just encourages students to explore on their own, learn on their own, as that tends to be the most effective way of learning. And those are kind of scattered throughout the entire course. And so what we also tried to do was to reflect the sort of cat and mouse game of exploit mitigations that surrounds the entire field of binary exploitation. And so when I say that there's a mitigation cat and mouse game, it fits pretty well into the typical view, typical mold of traditional video game progression. And so you have like buffer overflows, exploitation technique that we teach them, then you get stack cookies, targeted corruption, so on and so forth. Every lab level in the platform continually giving students a harder challenge, but never getting too hard. And so that's actually a key concept in game design known as flow, where you make things too easy, people get bored, they stop playing. You make things too hard, people just get frustrated, and the end result is the same, they stop playing. So trying to integrate that into security education helps make learning a lot more engaging, a lot more fun. It increases students' motivation. And so overall, we were really happy with how this latest iteration of modern binary exploitation went. And so we can't take full credit for our students' achievements, but just have a list of a bunch of companies that students who have taken this class are now working at in some security-focused capacity. And we also hired a summer intern who's actually here in the room out of this class. And so he's doing some pretty novel vulnerability research against the macOS kernel. And so it kind of implies like, yeah, we're pretty happy with this approach. We found that this is a very effective way of teaching binary exploitation. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Marcus, and he'll talk about broader applications.
Yeah, so having taught our one specialized subject to a diverse kind of group of university students, we recognize that we've only begun to kind of scratch the surface on the utility of these technologies. And so it's one platform, as we've kind of been calling it. But the thing is, there's a lot of potential for different courses you can teach. We love binary exploitation. We love the deep and dirty security subjects, like really low-level systems, complex stuff. But you can really teach any sort of university course, Comp Org, which is essentially a computer architecture course, operating systems, writing C code, stuff like that, embedded systems, and then reverse engineering, a dedicated reverse engineering course. We had some reverse engineering in our binary exploitation course, but there could be a whole course dedicated to that stuff. So yeah, all of these could be, or at least these three among others are very less niche courses. Excuse me. So benefits of gamification were really clear. It's even just the basic gamification that we try to put into this. It made the otherwise tedious material pretty engaging. And so it captivated students and dramatically increased the depth of their understanding. And when balanced properly, games can be used to make extremely technical problems into more human-friendly challenges, right? And so it makes these scary binaries and scary concepts into challenges that can be interfaced with by less specialized demographics, people with less qualifications, different age groups, and whatnot. And so there's supporting evidence that we're not the only ones that have this kind of line of thinking. In recent years, we've seen some games, some very widespread games that involve writing assembly code, designing circuits that have appealed to the masses. And so this is Shenzhen.io, it's available on Steam. You can see instructions, like CPU instructions, toy instructions essentially kind of in this circuit. Yeah, a bunch of wires connecting each other. You can see some digital or analog signals down here. Another popular one, TIS 100, some of you may have seen this, some of you may have played it. Another puzzle programming game where you must rewrite corrupted assembly code in these different CPU cores essentially, such that they will work together to produce a target output. So this is kind of this is where you need to go, and this is your attempt at recreating that target output. Another pretty wildly popular game. Axopump's brand new. This came out August 2018, so just 2 weeks ago, I think. This was actually inspired by Stuxnet, which we talked about earlier. There's more assembly code over here. I think these three games are actually all made by the same game dev. But it's all about essentially creating this malware that gets deeper and deeper into this industrial facility. Pretty cool. So finally, even Notch himself, you guys have all probably played Minecraft. He explored the idea of building a game that could teach elementary students how to write assembly code. What a very bizarre thing. And it was supposed to be, it was called OX10C. It's been since canceled, but it was supposed to be a space exploration kind of game in a similar aesthetic to Minecraft. You could program your ship's computers and different devices within the game world and stuff. Totally wild. And so what's most important about all this is that all age groups and demographics find solace in playing games, right? We do it for fun, we do it to relax. We got a lot of our students in our class being this would cut into my game time, or I found this course to be more of a game than a class, which was totally wild. It is so cool to get positive feedback like that. And we're confident that the methods and technology that we've discussed here are going to play an important role in making such material accessible to younger and otherwise less specialized students, say high school or K through 12 even. And so this is just high school computer lab, for example. But under the illusion of the game, it's possible to train almost anyone in these subjects. And so this includes military, or more and more recruits are being pulled right from basic training to build skills in subjects of cybersecurity because there's such a huge deficit. So if you've attended any of the talks lately here at ANYCON, you heard multiple people referencing the 3.5 million jobs by 2020 that are open and don't have people to fill. So yeah, we're in a huge deficit. And without requiring specialized software or hardware, the ability to scale both interest and participation into these niche subjects is easy, if not natural, when applying some of the strategies that we covered in this talk. And so that's actually all we have. We'll take questions. There's our emails if you actually want to reach out to us. Again, thank you for coming to the very last talk on ANYCON. And yeah, that's it. So any questions? Yeah, sure.
You said you released the 2017 version of your class on
Right.
GitHub. Did
Right.
you release the new one yet?
We haven't. So the thing is, we built it for the class, and we're exploring ways to make it more useful by people, I guess, besides ourselves, I guess, right? It's like a pre-release stage sort of where it's still got some rough edges, but we had a class of students banging away on it for 6 months, And so that really helped us iron out all the bugs and build this experience that we were relatively happy with. But we haven't released it yet because it's such a complex thing. But we figured that showing at least the strategies that we used to build the class that worked so well was useful. And so, yeah, that's absolutely something that we're trying to figure out how to get out there and get more people in. But yeah, the 2015 version of the course, which is available on GitHub. And so the most recent 2018 war game platform stuff that we just showed, that's not out yet. So, yep.
Is there a way we can follow you somewhere to?
You can follow us on Twitter. We have lots of Twitter people like us on Twitter. You can email us. We've got a website. Ret2.io is our website. It's pretty simple.
What's your Twitter handle?
Ret2 Systems. Yep. Yeah. And so our company name is actually a play on a common exploit technique known as Ret2libc, or sometimes Ret2 System. And so that's kind of where it comes from. So, any other questions? Questions? All right. Well, thanks for coming. That's all we've got. So.